This content is presented for educational and documentary purposes. It does not promote or glorify violence or criminal behavior. In 1970s Chicago, a man smiled at community meetings, shook hands, offered jobs, and sometimes put on clown makeup and a costume to entertain children. What if danger didn't look like danger? What if it were the helpful neighbor, the friendly businessman, the volunteer everyone knows? John Wayne Gacy seemed like the picture of the ideal citizen, until a teenager disappeared and the truth began to surface like a stench impossible to ignore. What police found was not just a criminal. It was a terrifying portrait of how normality can be staged, and how a predator can live in plain sight, hiding calculated sadism behind the mask of the family man. Today, we will examine an extreme double identity, trust as a trap, and the question that continues to haunt experts. How many masks can a person wear before believing that the truth is optional? Part 1. Opening the case file, late 1970s. Suburbs surrounding Chicago and Cook County, Illinois. To an outsider, it's the portrait of orderly America. Residential streets, neatly trimmed lawns, neighborhood schools, community associations, churches, local clubs, and a routine that seems to shield families from the chaos of the big city. It's also a time when the idea of being a good citizen still works as a powerful social pass. Those who show up at events, shake hands, help political campaigns, and smile for cameras are usually met with trust. Sometimes, too much trust. It's in this environment that the file is opened, a case in which a public image was, for years, the best camouflage for horror. John Wayne Gacy did not look like a threat. On the contrary, in the eyes of many, he was the guy from the neighborhood. A construction business owner, outgoing, a volunteer involved in civic activities, and on some occasions, someone who wore makeup and a costume to entertain children as a clown at community events. This detail is crucial to understanding why the case became culturally iconic. It's not just about serial crimes. It's about the violent breach of the emotional contract that sustains community life. When the person who represents safety and normality is, in fact, the risk. Everyone asks the same question: how did no one see it? At that time, police and society were dealing with a type of disappearance that often slipped through bureaucratic and moral cracks. Young people, especially teenagers and young men at the start of adulthood, could easily be classified as runaways, troubled, living a double life, or bad influences. In practical terms, that meant lost time, hours and days in which the disappearance did not receive the urgency it required. The Gacy case thrived in this silence. A predator benefits when the victim is treated as a statistic rather than a person. The setting, then, is one of contrast. On one side, a suburb that believes in routine, neighborhood ties, and reputation. On the other, a series of absences that, taken individually, seem like background noise. The turning point comes when the absences stop being just missing persons and begin to form an investigative pattern. And that pattern would later be tied to a number that became a historical marker. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders involving young males in crimes committed throughout the 1970s. What makes this case span generations and still intrigue experts is the psychological structure behind the double identity. Not in the caricatured sense of two people inside one, but in the more disturbing sense. An individual capable of managing social masks as tools, choosing when to seem helpful, when to be charming, when to be useful. The clown here is not the moral center of the case. It's an easy cultural symbol to fix in memory. The essence lies elsewhere. The use of normality as a disguise and other people's trust as an entry point. When investigations close in on Gacy, they're not just approaching a suspect, they're approaching a paradox. Because in the collective imagination, a serial killer is supposed to look dangerous, supposed to live on the margins, supposed to leave obvious clues. But Gacy was the opposite of the stereotype. He had social presence, businesses, apparent stability. And that's precisely why the case becomes a bitter lesson in applied criminology. Dangerousness is not aesthetic, it's behavioral. From the moment his name consistently enters the radar, the case changes temperature. From just another disappearance It becomes an investigation that pressures institutions, tests the patience of families, and exposes systemic failures. The FBI even offered investigative assistance to local authorities, an indication that the scope and complexity of the case no longer fit within routine police work. And yet, the most frightening aspect isn't the statistic, it's the social domino effect. Because with every detail that emerges, the community is forced to confront a simple, devastating question. How many times was the mask applauded while the danger was just a few feet away? How many doors were opened because he seemed trustworthy? How many warnings were ignored because his reputation seemed solid? The file records an objective milestone. Gacy was arrested in December 1978, and what unfolded from there redefined the case as one of the most notorious in U.S. criminal history. And the judicial outcome, years later, cemented its historical weight. Conviction in 1980, followed by a death sentence and execution by lethal injection in 1994 in the state of Illinois. But at this point in the documentary, when the file is opened and the first pages are turned, what matters is understanding the frame. A suburb that trusted appearances, a system that didn't always react quickly to the disappearance of young people, and a man who knew how to hide in plain sight. This is the case where terror didn't knock on the door, it was invited inside. Part 2. The mind behind the crimes. To understand why this case still intrigues specialists, it's necessary to face John Wayne Gacy as a project of image before facing him as a criminal. The mask was not a detail, it was a strategy. And in the American suburbs of the 1970s, social strategy was worth almost as much as physical evidence. Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942 into a working-class family, the only male child among 3 siblings. Behind the normality of a Catholic and traditional household, a recurring axis appears in many accounts of the case. A difficult relationship with his father, described as an alcoholic and abusive, and a boy growing up amid pressure, humiliation, and a constant need for approval. This point does not explain what he would become, but it helps illuminate the kind of void that certain individuals try to fill with performance, power, and control. In his youth, Gacy flirted with instability. He dropped out of school, took on various jobs, spent time in Las Vegas, and even worked at a mortuary for a few months. A detail that, on its own, fuels the popular imagination, but that matters here for another reason. Proximity to environments where death is operationalized can desensitize, trivialize, or simply coexist with a personality already inclined to compartmentalize emotions. He also studied and graduated from a business school, Northwestern Business College, a step that signals ambition and a desire for upward mobility, something that appears as a consistent trait in his biography. As a young adult, Gacy quickly learned the social language that opens doors: friendliness, energy, presence. He became involved in associative and civic environments, those spaces where reputation turns into currency. This is a key element of the extreme double identity. Public Gacy was not merely cordial, he was useful. And useful people are often defended even when strange signs emerge, because the community doesn't want to lose its own sense of security. It's also during this phase that an earlier and very important milestone comes into play. In 1968, Gacy was convicted in Iowa of sodomy involving a teenager, receiving a 10-year sentence, but serving a much shorter period before being released. This fact, beyond its criminal impact, reveals something psychologically relevant. There was already a history of sexual transgression and violence, abuse of power, and yet later on, he would manage to rebuild his image with impressive efficiency. His return to the Chicago area years later functions almost like a second debut. He settles in, builds a business, becomes a contractor, and comes to be seen as a hardworking man with initiative. Someone who employs young people, circulates among acquaintances, seems practical and decisive. In the social imagination, this profile is often interpreted as a sign of stability and reliability. For a social predator, it's the perfect disguise. The more normal he appears, the less people question small inconsistencies. That's where contradiction turns into mechanism. On the outside, Gacy displayed charisma and community integration. He was the kind of person who showed up, talked, participated, appeared in photographs, occupied space. On the inside, according to accounts and investigations that would later surface, there existed a pattern of predatory behavior, driven by control, domination, and sadism, something that doesn't arise out of nowhere. It arises from the ability to separate worlds within oneself, as if they were sealed compartments. The nickname Killer Clown is born precisely from the dissonance between these layers. He did perform as a clown at events and parties, a cultural symbol of innocence and trust. But the most important point isn't the costume, it's what it represents. Gacy understood that society trusts archetypes: the businessman, the volunteer, the nice guy, the children's entertainer. Each label functions as psychological armor. When someone tries to suspect, the mind immediately responds, it doesn't fit. This ability to sustain a persona, however, comes with an internal cost. It requires coldness, calculation, and above all, a peculiar emotional ethic, one in which the other is not seen as a complete subject, but as an object for use. In accessible terms, it's as if to Gacy, people were pieces on a board. Some serve for prestige, others for pleasure, others for disposal. This is not a diagnosis. It's a behavioral reading compatible with patterns criminologists often associate with antisocial and narcissistic traits: manipulation, instrumental lying, lack of practical empathy, and a chronic need to dominate situations. Another aspect frequently cited by biographers and documentarians is the conflict surrounding sexuality and shame, not as justification, but as an ingredient of the internal labyrinth. A man who at the same time sought traditional social acceptance and carried impulses and fantasies he did not publicly admit. Some sources describe this tension as a struggle with his own sexuality and internalized homophobia. In certain criminal profiles, this kind of conflict can become fuel for displaced rage. When an individual cannot tolerate a part of himself, he tries to destroy outside what he cannot bear inside. And then comes the question that makes Gacy such a perfect case study of the social mask. Why does no one suspect the man who's seen at barbecues, meetings, community events? Because he offered what every human group values: presence, usefulness, a smile, and a ready-made narrative. He wasn't just a nice guy. He was a guy with a story, a guy with a role, a guy with ties. When the investigation finally closes in, it closes in on an individual already shielded by reputation. And that's where the case reveals its institutional dimension. Trusting appearances too much can delay responses. Treating certain disappearances as runaways can be fatal. But as a psychological figure, Gacy fits a specific type of predator. The predator who hunts with normality. He doesn't rely solely on force, and he relies on persuasion. He doesn't invade, he's invited. He doesn't present himself as a risk, he sells himself as a solution, as an opportunity, as someone good. And that is the core of extreme double identity, the ability to act as if there were two worlds with no moral communication between them. The press and popular culture crystallize this contrast as spectacle, but the real file is colder. Gacy was arrested after an investigation that intensified with the disappearance of Robert Piest in December 1978, and later convicted of 33 homicides, a number that marked American criminal history. He would be executed years later, in 1994, in the state of Illinois. And still, what remains, what allows the case to survive over time, isn't just the how many, it's the how. How can an entire community coexist with someone like this? The answer almost always begins in the same place: the mask. Gacy built a life in which appearance was not a consequence, it was a tool. And those who use social tools with that level of skill don't need to be loved, they only need to be believed. Part 3. Who these victims really were. Before any number, there were faces, there were routines. There were people coming home from work, stopping by the store, going to visit friends, taking a side job, planning a weekend. And that's where the John Wayne Gacy case takes on its most painful layer. The victims were not supporting characters in the story of a notorious criminal. They were entire lives cut off mid-sentence. In general, The profile of victims associated with Gacy centers on teenage and young adult males, many of them at transitional ages, that point when life is still being built. A first job, the beginning of independence, family conflicts, the search for acceptance. Multiple sources point to a range that largely spans from 14 to the early 20s, with a predominance of young men who circulated in the Chicago area and nearby suburbs. This detail is fundamental not only to the timeline of the case, but to understanding why so many disappearances took so long to gain traction. Young people at this stage can be interpreted by adults and institutions as unstable, rebellious, or gone by choice. And a predator leans on that the way one leans on a solid wall. When society treats certain disappearances with less urgency, time passes, and time in this kind of crime is an advantage. In the Gacy case, the investigation and legal proceedings would ultimately crystallize a fact that became historical. He was convicted of 33 homicides, and there is an aspect that remains an open wound for families and specialists alike. 5 victims remain unidentified. In other words, even after decades, there are still people who were taken from the world without the world being able to say, with certainty, who they were. And that is not just a statistic, it is nameless grief. And here comes the point you emphasized as mandatory, how these victims were killed. The most consistent sources describe that Gacy, in many cases, subjected victims to sexual violence and torture before killing them, and that the method of death, in most cases, was strangulation or asphyxiation, including the use of a type of rope or garrote in some of the crimes. This pattern matters because it reveals a component of control and domination. It wasn't just about killing, but about imposing power over another person. When we talk about these victims, there's a common true crime trap, turning people into patterns. But the case file insists on something different. Many were sons. Some were younger brothers. Some were trying to establish themselves financially. Others had active social lives. Some were young people with vulnerabilities. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time in front of the wrong person. What connects them is not a personality type. What connects them is how a predator chooses targets. People who are accessible, people who can be persuaded, people whose absence may take longer to be treated as an emergency. And here emerges one of the most disturbing elements of the case: social proximity. Gacy was someone who, in the eyes of many, offered opportunities. A man who seemed to have work, contacts, a structured life. This kind of respectability can function as a collective anesthetic. When a young person says, "I'm going to meet a contractor about a job," that in a suburb that values work and initiative sounds almost like good news. In the emblematic case of 15-year-old Robert Piest, the disappearance after mentioning a possible work-related contact became the decisive trigger for the investigation to move forward. But it would be unfair to reduce the group of victims to the moment of disappearance. The real impact appears afterward in what's left behind. Parents who replay the last conversation, siblings who grow older carrying a lifelong what if, friends who blame themselves for not insisting, communities that begin to distrust every act of kindness. In crimes like these, the violence doesn't end with the act. It spreads in waves, psychological, familial, communal, and often lasts longer than the criminal's own life. It's also important to record how the case carries a delicate social component. Part of the victim group consisted of young people who, in certain contexts, may have been judged by their own community because of lifestyle rumors or the prejudices of the time. This matters because prejudice, when it enters institutional machinery, turns into delay, turns into neglect, turns into fewer resources, and consequently, into greater risk for those who are already vulnerable. The Gacy case exposes this with cruelty. When a victim doesn't seem perfect, they may receive less urgency. And that is a collective failure that serial killers exploit. So when the public hears 33, it's tempting to imagine a closed, organized, resolved number. But the case insists on another truth. The suffering is not closed, and it is not organized. 5 victims still have no names. Families still live with questions. And every late identification, Every forensic reconstruction, every confirmed identity is a reminder that behind the macabre fame of the killer clown, there were 33 stories that never asked to become symbols. At this point, the documentary needs to pause and look at the moral center of the story. The victims were young people with futures, and those futures were stolen. Not by a visible monster, but by someone who, on the outside, seemed ordinary. That is what makes the case so devastating. It didn't just destroy individual lives, it contaminated the very idea of trust. Part 4. Behavioral Signature. John Wayne Gacy's behavioral signature doesn't begin with violence. It begins with permission. He didn't look like a predator lying in wait. He looked like a functional adult offering something that, to many young people, sounded like opportunity. A job, money, drinks, a ride, a favor, an open door. That's the first pillar of the pattern. Gacy hunted using the language of trust, and in a community that valued work and initiative, going over to the contractor's house could sound almost routine. Sources describe that he primarily lured victims into his own home, a space that is symbolically the ultimate territory of control. There, the setting was predictable for him and unknown for the young person, a perfect asymmetry. The approach varied but followed a constant logic. Isolate a young man, create closeness, lower resistance, and then turn trust into a trap. Victim selection and social baits. The general profile, teenage and young adult males, aligns with what an offender like Gacy looks for. Accessibility, situational vulnerability, and an absence that could often be downplayed by society. He disappeared. He ran away. He went off to live his life. He approached both people he knew and complete strangers, and there are reports that he sought out young men at urban points and transit routes, offering work at his construction company, PDM, or proposing alcohol, drugs, or money in exchange for sex. In some episodes, he allegedly even used signs of authority to convince victims, such as staging himself as someone from law enforcement, something that increases submission without the need for immediate force. The pattern in behavioral criminology terms is clear. The victim is chosen not for who they are, but for how easy they are to control on the way to the attack location. The theater of control. The trap as ritual. Inside the house, the most frequently cited element of Gacy's behavior is the staging of a game or trick in which he convinced the victim to accept some form of physical restraint under the pretense of a demonstration. This part is essential because it reveals something beyond the crime itself. It reveals ritual. It's not just an efficient method, it's a psychological signature. In simple terms, the trap functioned like a switch that changed the environment. Up to that point, there was conversation and an appearance of normality. After the trick, total domination began. What makes this so disturbing is that the method relies less on force and more on persuasion, as if the offender needed to prove to himself that he could make the other person cooperate with their own captivity. Sources also indicate that after immobilizing the victims, he committed sexual violence and torture. And here it's important to maintain a responsible tone. There's no need to go into graphic detail to understand the essential point. The crime was not just homicide. It was a package of degradation in which the other person's suffering was part of the psychological function of the act. Method of death: strangulation, asphyxia. As a signature, the method of death most associated with the case, and repeated across multiple reliable summaries, is strangulation or asphyxiation, often described as Gacy's typical method. This matters because strangulation in behavioral terms usually involves proximity, time, and direct control over the outcome. It's not a distance act. For certain predators, this connects to fantasies of absolute power, deciding when another person breathes, when another person stops. It is domination taken to its extreme. Time, repetition, and escalation. When the pattern becomes routine, another disturbing trait is repetition. The pattern solidified over the course of the 1970s, and sources point out that a large portion of the homicides occurred during this period, with a significant number concentrated after changes in his personal life, such as his divorce. For an outside observer, what stands out is how the crime seems to have integrated into the offender's everyday life. Work, community, social mask, and in parallel, attacks, concealment, and a return to normal the next day. This is compartmentalization in its rawest form. The individual switches roles as if one reality does not contaminate the other. Concealment and possession, the fate of the bodies, the final phase of the modus operandi, and perhaps the most symbolic, is what he did afterward. Most victims were buried in the space beneath the house, the crawl space, and in areas of the property. Others were discarded in the Des Plaines River. This choice says a lot. Keeping bodies close, like literally under his own floor, can be read as a form of possession, as if the victims were transformed into material secrets, something the offender controlled even after death. At the same time, it's a practical solution. The location is familiar, accessible, and for years invisible to ordinary eyes. When he began using the river in some cases, that also suggests adaptation to risk, changing disposal methods to reduce the chance of detection. In the end, Gacy's behavioral signature can be summarized as a 5-stage cycle: social approach, isolation, a ritual of control, sexual violence and homicide by strangulation, asphyxiation, and body concealment. He didn't depend on chaos, he depended on order, on the house, on reputation, on the mask. Part 5. The investigation and the hunt for the mind behind the crimes. The hunt for John Wayne Gacy didn't begin with a big break. It began the way many difficult investigations do, with an absence that didn't fit everyday life, and with a family that refused to accept the easy explanation. In December 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest changed the temperature of the case. He wasn't just another missing teen. There was routine, there was timing, there were witnesses. There was the kind of trail that allows police to ask the right question. Who was the last person to see him? And quickly, one name began to surface around the disappearance. John Wayne Gacy, the well-known contractor, the socially connected man, precisely the kind of person many struggled to imagine as a threat. This is the investigation's first psychological barrier, the normalcy bias. When a suspect looks like a model citizen, the mind, including the institutional mind, tends to search for alternative explanations. It's a human mechanism. Reputation becomes a shield, and in a suburb, reputation can function as an informal alibi. But experienced investigators don't live on impressions alone. They live on consistency. And as inquiries progressed, the Piest case didn't behave like a typical disappearance. There were inconsistencies in statements, movements that didn't add up, signs that something had been forcibly interrupted, not in a sensational sense, but in the sense of a broken trajectory. From there, police weren't trying to prove Gacy is a monster. They were trying to do something colder and more effective, tie together facts that would hold up in court. The next step was a classic move in high-risk investigations: watch without alarming. Authorities began keeping Gacy under surveillance, waiting for the human mistake that almost always happens when someone believes too much in their own mask. Surveillance in cases like this serves a dual purpose: to gather objective signals, movements, meetings, patterns, and, at the same time, to gauge the suspect's behavior under pressure. Because pressure changes people. Some become more cautious, others become more impulsive. At the same time, the investigation widened its scope. When a young person disappears with ties to an adult who has a criminal history, an inevitable question arises: has this happened before? And this is where the case begins to turn into a web. Police started correlating previous disappearances and examining Gacy's surroundings more closely, a process that carries enormous technical weight in serial crimes. It's not just about suspecting. It's about establishing pattern, victims with similar profiles, disappearances under similar circumstances, geographic proximity, the recurring presence of the same name. Once suspicion gained enough density, formal measures came into play. Warrants, searches, seizures. The goal wasn't to find something shocking. It was to find evidence that spoke directly to the specific disappearance that opened the door with the Piest case. In the real world, investigations of this scale need a ladder. One rung leads to the next, and the first rung is often a concrete, verifiable element that links the suspect to the victim's last known contact. Tension rose because Gacy was not just any suspect. He was someone who knew how to move socially, how to talk, how to project control, and that's dangerous terrain for investigators. People like that often try to turn an interrogation into a conversation into a negotiation, and a negotiation into confusion. It's a psychological game. The suspect tries to set the pace, occupy space, wear the other person down, create noise. The investigative team must do the opposite, reduce the case to facts, dates, objects, routes, contradictions. As the net tightened, the case entered a phase many investigators describe as the point of no return. When you feel you're close, but you still don't have the final piece. And that's when one of the most emblematic moments of the Gacy case emerges. The path leading to the house on West Somerdale Avenue, and the search for signs that would support the most serious hypothesis. According to widely cited records, it was during this period that the investigation advanced to the macabre discovery that some victims were connected to the space beneath the house, and that the scale of the crime was greater than any initial suspicion. It's important to understand what this means institutionally. When a case stops being a disappearance and becomes the possibility of multiple homicides, the investigation changes scale. Resources increase, teams expand, forensic work intensifies, and there's an official data point that confirms this shift. The FBI recorded that it provided investigative assistance to Illinois authorities in the case. The hunt then becomes more than just a police effort. It turns into a coordinated operation, identifying victims, cross-referencing records, reconstructing timelines, determining how many disappearances may be connected. This phase is often the most emotionally taxing for investigators, because each new confirmation isn't progress in the usual sense. It's the realization that the horror was greater than previously imagined. When Gacy was finally arrested on December 21st, 1978, the case entered what the public often sees as the resolution, but what investigators know is only the beginning of a second battle, the battle of proof. Because arresting a suspect is one thing, sustaining dozens of charges with solidity is another. At that point, the investigation became almost surgical, locating remains, documenting every finding, preserving the chain of custody, reconstructing who and when, separating inference from evidence. The official dimension of this appears later in the judicial process. Gacy would be tried and charged with 33 homicides, along with other charges associated with the case. And here the case clearly demonstrates something specialists repeat as a bitter rule. Serial killers aren't caught by genius. They're caught when a specific victim triggers a specific investigation that finds a specific crack in the mask. In the Gacy case, the disappearance of Robert Piest was that inflection point. At the end of this hunt, what remains isn't just a name in handcuffs. What remains is a painful mental map for an entire community. The realization that trust, when distributed without discernment, can be exploited by those who understand social performance. And there remains the hardest investigative lesson of all. When disappearances are treated as probably runaways, time becomes the offender's accomplice. Part 6. The Endgame. Capture, Trial, and Closure. The capture of John Wayne. Gacy didn't unfold like an epic finale. It happened the way major collapses often do, when the mask starts to crack because of a detail too concrete to be explained away with charisma. In December 1978, with the investigation closing in on his surroundings, Gacy came under close observation. And under surveillance, the community man began to show signs of strain. Not a cinematic breakdown, but the kind of unease investigators recognize: mood swings, impatience, irritability, the sense that the suspect is calculating the next move. As the net tightened, police found legal ways to keep him under control while building support for another search. A game of institutional patience: hold without rushing, advance without losing the case in court. The decisive moment came when authorities were able to move forward with searches at the residence. From that point on, the investigation stopped operating solely on hypothesis and began dealing with something colder and definitive: evidence of homicide. It's the kind of shift that changes the weight of the air in a room and also changes a suspect's behavior. According to widely cited reconstructions, after the discovery of human remains and the formal acknowledgement that he was now facing murder charges, Gacy reportedly said he wanted to clear the air. And then came the stage that would turn the case into one of the most notorious in the United States: the confession. On December 22, 1978, he confessed to police that he had killed dozens of young men and indicated that many of the bodies were buried beneath his house. This kind of confession doesn't end an investigation. It opens a new front: locating, documenting, identifying, preserving the chain of custody, and turning horror into evidence. From there, the case enters its second major act: the courtroom. Gacy was brought to trial in Cook County, and the charges reflected the scale of what had been uncovered: 33 counts of murder, along with charges related to sexual crimes and other offenses connected to the case. In March 1980, he was found guilty. His behavior during this period is generally described as that of someone trying to maintain control, challenging narratives, minimizing, reorganizing facts in his favor. A posture that aligns with the psychological core of the case: the belief that one's own version can replace reality. The defense pursued an insanity defense, a complex legal mechanism that doesn't mean acting strange or having problems, but rather alleging a level of mental incapacity relevant to criminal responsibility under the law. The jury, however, rejected this argument and held him responsible for the crimes. The sentence came as the state's final weight. Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980. He remained on death row for years, with appeals moving through state and federal courts until his execution was scheduled. The end came on May 10, 1994, at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Journalistic accounts described technical problems during the procedure, which caused it to last longer than expected, adding a dark layer to the institutional closure of the case. Even death, in this instance, did not come cleanly, but with the imperfect coldness of a human process. Last meal and final words. Recent sources detail that his last meal included fast food items and sides, such as KFC chicken, shrimp, French fries, strawberries, and Diet Coke. His last words are widely reported as the phrase "kiss my ass," often cited as a final gesture of defiance and lack of remorse. And here, the documentary needs to be honest about the human impact of this ending. For part of the public, the execution seems to close the case. For many families, it does not, because it brings no one back, does not correct years of absence, and does not answer every question, including identities that remained unknown for decades. What it does is end the physical presence of the offender, but it does not erase the psychological waves of what was done. In the final record, the status is unequivocal. John Wayne Gacy died executed by the state of Illinois in 1994. But the shadow he left behind continues to be studied precisely because of what you defined as the central premise of this episode: extreme double identity, the ability to live as a family man, businessman, volunteer, while committing serial violence. And that contrast in court and beyond it was the case's true weapon, not to save him, but to delay the world's perception of who he really was. Part 7: Psychological Breakdown of the Case. If there is a reason the John Wayne Gacy case remains alive in the minds of specialists, it isn't only the number of victims. It's the psychological architecture that allowed him to occupy at the same time two roles that seem incompatible: the socially accepted man, businessman, volunteer, neighborhood figure, and the predator who turned trust into captivity. The psychological analysis of Gacy requires an essential care. Understanding is not absolving. Explaining mechanisms is not offering excuses. The goal here is to open the engine of a criminal mind so the audience can recognize real patterns, how social masks work, how certain collective vulnerabilities are exploited, and how violence can emerge from the combination of internal fantasies, a need for control, and opportunity. The emotional root, the hunger for approval and the poison of humiliation. Gacy grew up in an environment where affection and validation seemed to come at a price. Biographical sources describe a difficult relationship with his father, marked by alcoholism, verbal and physical abuse, and recurring humiliation, including attacks on the son's masculinity, treating him as weak, soft, insufficient. This kind of family dynamic often produces two internal movements that can coexist. 1. Social hypervigilance. The child learns to read the room to avoid explosions. Later, this can become an adult skill, knowing what people want to hear, when to smile, when to please, when to perform. 2. Encapsulated anger. When a child has no safe space to express indignation, anger doesn't disappear, it reorganizes. In some individuals, it becomes cynicism. In others, a compulsion for control. In others, fantasies of domination. Because dominating others is a perverse way of never feeling dominated again. It's important to say this clearly. Millions of people suffer abuse and never become violent. What this origin helps explain is not why someone kills, but how certain ingredients can prepare the ground for a personality that seeks compensation through distorted paths. A lifetime trying to prove to an internal judge that now he's the one in charge. The mask is identity. When seeming becomes a tool, Gacy didn't use the social mask only as camouflage. In many ways, it was a second skin, the layer that protected him from emptiness, shame, and feelings of inferiority. By building the image of the active businessman, the volunteer, the useful citizen, he wasn't just deceiving others, he was also manufacturing a tolerable version of himself. This point is crucial to understanding the extreme double identity that you want as the central premise of this episode. It isn't about a mystical double, nor a sudden transformation. It's about compartmentalization, the ability to divide life into emotional compartments like drawers that don't touch. In drawer 1, the man who shakes hands, talks, solves problems, receives praise. In drawer 2, the man who seeks absolute control, abuses, kills, hides, and returns to normal. And moving from one drawer to the other doesn't necessarily require moral conflict. It only requires the belief that the drawers are independent. This type of functioning resembles what many clinicians describe as moral dissociation, not in the clinical sense of dissociative disorders, but in the everyday psychological sense. When the individual separates the act from the human meaning of the act, the victim stops being someone and becomes something. Empathy stops being a reflex and becomes an optional resource. Multiple personalities. The story he tried to sell. During evaluations and in the context of the trial, Gacy claimed to have multiple personalities and even described distinct personas, including an evil persona associated with the crimes. This element is fascinating not because it's true, but because it reveals a psychological pattern typical of manipulators, having a ready-made narrative to shift responsibility. In court, the defense focused on the insanity defense, a theme widely discussed in legal analyses of the case. The jury, however, held him responsible and convicted him of 33 homicides. From a psychological perspective, the personality's story can be read in two compatible ways. Strategy, offering the system an explanation that sounds medical and therefore capable of generating doubt. Functional self-deception, building a narrative that allows him to continue seeing himself as good on some level. After all, it wasn't me, it was another part of me. In both cases, the emotional goal is the same, avoiding full moral weight. And this connects to something very common in profiles with antisocial traits. Outsourcing blame. Someone always provoked it. Someone always deserved it. Someone always forced the situation. Guilt always lives outside. Traits compatible with psychopathy and antisocial personality. This is the point where many people want a definitive label. Was he a psychopath? The responsible answer is, there are behaviors widely compatible with psychopathic antisocial traits. But a definitive clinical diagnosis requires careful formal evaluation and is not the goal of this script. Still, it's instructive to point out the cluster of signs specialists often observe in offenders with this pattern. Superficial charm and manipulation. He knew how to move socially and persuade people. Instrumental lying. Lying not as defense, but as a tool. Lack of observable remorse. Reports from the case and from his final period suggest little to no consistent public regret. Objectification of others. Victims treated as means for pleasure control. Functional double life. The ability to maintain work, relationships, routine, while committing serious crimes. The FBI's own description of the case emphasizes the conviction for 33 homicides and federal investigative assistance, reinforcing the scale and serial pattern. Behaviorally, what defines the engine is not the clown makeup. It's the use of people as objects in an internal script. Sexuality, shame, and displaced hostility. One of the most complex elements, and one that requires care to avoid prejudice, is the relationship between sexuality, shame, and aggression. The case involves young male victims, and there are biographical records of earlier sexual offenses and of a cultural context where homophobia and stigma were intense. The psychological point here is not sexual orientation. The point is conflict and shame. In some individuals, shame becomes withdrawal. In others, rage. In others, a need to dominate what threatens their self-image. If Gacy grew up being told he was weak, less of a man, and built himself outwardly as a respectable, macho, useful citizen, there is a plausible, and only hypothetical, interpretation that he transformed part of his internal conflict into external hostility. Not because desire leads to violence, but because in predatory minds, desire can mix with contempt, and contempt can mix with punishment. The victim then stops being someone. They become a mirror of what he hates in himself, and destroying the mirror seems, in the offender's twisted logic, to restore control. The choice of victims as psychological symbol. A serial killer rarely chooses victims at random. Opportunity matters, of course, but so does meaning. In Gacy's case, the general profile, teenage and young adult males, may carry symbolic layers. Youth as raw material for power. Young people are easier to deceive with promises of work, rides, money. Situational vulnerability is an invitation to the predator. Masculinity in dispute. If he spent his life trying to prove masculinity to his father and the world, dominating young men can become a perverse proof of superiority. Role substitution. In some readings, victims may function as avatars of earlier figures: the humiliating father, the rejecting peer, the judging world. It's not literal, it's psychological. He reenacts in the other a story he wants to rewrite. The intimate logic of such a predator is often, now I control the scene. Now I decide. The crime becomes a theater in which he finally occupies the role of director. The trigger and the escalation, when fantasy meets opportunity. Behavioral criminology specialists often view serial crime as an escalation process. Fantasy, rehearsal, execution, repetition. In Gacy's case, fantasy appears to have met a structural opportunity. A house, privacy, reputation, social circulation, access to young people through employment and contacts. A dangerous combination. Escalation doesn't have to mean more spectacular. Escalation can mean more frequent, more confident, more automated. Repetition creates a kind of tolerance. The offender comes to need the act not only for pleasure, but for emotional regulation. And here we arrive at the psychological function of the crime. The psychological function of the crime. What did it serve inside his mind? In profiles like Gacy's, the crime usually fulfills multiple functions at once. Absolute control. Dominating another person anesthetizes the internal feeling of powerlessness. Narcissistic reinforcement. The idea of I can fool everyone feeds grandiosity. Release of anger, not momentary anger, but old, accumulated, displaced rage. Sexual pleasure mixed with power. In sadistic sexual crimes, arousal may be tied to control and humiliation, not to sex as connection. Shame management. Paradoxically, the act that should generate shame can temporarily silence it, because the offender feels on top, not beneath. This creates a closed circuit. The more he practices, the more the behavior becomes a solution to uncomfortable internal states. The mental loop: frustration, fantasy, planning, execution, relief, emptiness, repetition. To make this clear to the audience, imagine Gacy's inner world as a hallway with doors. On ordinary days, he walks through the citizen door. He handles things, smiles, manages impressions, but inside him exists a core tension, a baseline discomfort, fed by old humiliations, daily frustrations, rejection, the feeling of not being recognized enough. The loop can be described like this: frustration, something wounds the ego or awakens emptiness, something banal, a slight, a criticism, a domestic conflict, a feeling of being ignored. Fantasy, the mind seeks an image that restores power. Fantasy appears as an emotional medicine. Planning, the offender begins thinking about opportunity. Who is accessible? Who can be persuaded? What situation allows control? Execution, the act occurs and fulfills its internal function. Important, this is not blind impulse, it's behavior with internal logic. Relief, for a short period there is release, as if tension had been drained. Emptiness, anger, the relief fades. Emptiness returns, irritation returns. Sometimes paranoia about being discovered appears, sometimes boredom. Repetition, to regain relief and power, he returns to fantasy. The cycle restarts. This loop is one of the reasons serial crimes can continue for years when there is no interruption. The crime becomes a form of regulation, monstrous but functional for the offender. He doesn't kill only because he wants to. He kills because in that internal logic, killing solves something inside him. It solves for minutes what he cannot solve internally in a healthy way. Why does strangulation asphyxia appear so often in this type of profile? Without going into operational details, which don't serve the public and shouldn't be taught, it's relevant to understand the psychological meaning of homicide methods that require proximity and direct control. Reports and case syntheses indicate that many of the deaths occurred by strangulation asphyxiation, often after restraint and sexual violence. In many sadistic profiles, the physical closeness of the act is not accidental. It's part of the psychological reward, seeing power happen, feeling control happen, deciding the boundary between life and death. This connects directly to the core of the case: control as a drug, the house as stage, crime as territory. Another psychologically revealing aspect is the fact that many crimes were tied to the domestic space and to concealing bodies beneath the residence. This isn't just convenience. It's symbolism. The house is the place of the social persona. It's where the citizen lives. When the predator turns the house into a crime scene, he mixes the everyday with the secret, and paradoxically, that can increase the sense of power. He lives on top of the secret and is still seen as normal. It's as if the ground itself becomes a vault. And this vault doesn't store money. It stores proof that he controls two realities at once. For a grandiose ego, that can be intoxicating. Social manipulation, how he bought trust. Gacy was, above all, a social predator. He hunted more with conversation than with initial force. This involves simple human techniques, and that's why they're frightening. Offering something desired, work, money, validation, creating a sense of exclusive opportunity. I can help you. Normalizing the strange. It's just a joke. It's a test. It's nothing. Leaning on reputation. Everyone knows me. None of this requires genius. It requires emotional reading and absence of scruples. And that brings us to why the mask was so effective. Communities tend to trust superficial signals of reliability: employment, volunteering, public presence. The case is a brutal reminder that displayed virtue can be a predator's tool. The role of the system and of time. When society becomes part of the scene, A serial killer's mind doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates within a culture. In the late 1970s, disappearances of teenagers and young adults, especially those who could be labeled as runaways, didn't always receive immediate response. That creates time. And time, for a serial offender, is like air. The FBI vault records that the FBI provided investigative assistance to Illinois authorities and emphasizes the conviction for 33 homicides of youths between 14 and 21 years old, reinforcing the victim pattern and the institutional scale of the case. When an investigation has to reach that level, it's because the case has already exceeded local boundaries. Deep psychological conclusion. Why did Gacy kill? The question, why did he kill, has easy false answers. Because he was crazy? Because he was the clown? Because he was a monster? Those answers comfort because they push danger away from the real world. But the true terror of the Gacy case is exactly the opposite. He was functional enough to go unnoticed. The most honest and instructive answer is that, within his internal logic, killing seemed to fulfill three central needs. 1. Power. He needed to feel above, in control, immune to the judgment that had haunted him since childhood. 2. Emotional regulation. The crime worked as a temporary discharge and anesthetic for emptiness, shame, anger, and frustration. 3. Identity. Paradoxically, the secret and the double life may have become part of his identity, a real self, hidden beneath the social self. Instead of moral conflict, there was a sense of superiority in deceiving the world. When an individual combines a need for control, the ability to manipulate, and an absence of practical empathy, the result can be exactly what this case represents: a predator who doesn't need a monster's mask, because he wears the mask of an ordinary man. That's why the case still intrigues specialists. Not because it's mysterious, but because it's a dark manual on how normality can be staged, and on how an entire community can lean on appearances until reality explodes. Part 8. The Final Reckoning. Lessons from the Darkness. There are cases that end in a courtroom, and there are cases that end inside people. John Wayne Gacy's belongs to the second category, because he wasn't just a serial killer. He was a kind of crack in the glass of normality, and once the glass cracks, no one looks at the reflection the same way again. When the state executed Gacy on May 10, 1994, the legal system closed a judicial cycle. But the emotional cycle, the one that involves families, communities, and an entire society, is much harder to close. Because what this case destroys isn't just a set of lives, it's also a set of certainties. The belief that danger always looks dangerous, the belief that good people are always good people, the belief that evil is something external, easy to recognize, easy to avoid. Gacy taught the opposite, and that's why his name still echoes decades later. What remains, in the end, is the image of a man who understood social mechanics better than many decent people do. A man who didn't need to force his way in. He entered by invitation. He entered through trust. He entered through reputation. And that's what makes the case so culturally iconic. The feeling that the community wasn't just deceived, it was used. As if collective goodwill itself, the willingness to believe, to help, to give someone a chance, had been turned into a weapon against itself. There is something deeply human and deeply dangerous in this need to believe. We trust because we have to trust. Life and society depends on it. You can't live suspecting every smile, every favor, every person who presents themselves as good. But the Gacy case shows the other side of that pact. When trust becomes automatic, when reputation turns into an unquestionable shield, when disappearances become statistical noise, space opens up for the predator to walk with steady, invisible steps. And then comes the most uncomfortable part, looking at the structure that allowed the continuity. The investigation only becomes unavoidable when the disappearance of one specific young person, Robert Piest, creates a thread too strong to ignore. How many earlier threads were seen as too weak? How many disappearances were classified as runaways, bad paths, family problems? The story doesn't suggest that anyone wanted this to happen. It suggests something sadder, that institutional neglect is often silent, and silence is the perfect shelter for a hunter. At the moral center of this case, however, is not the killer. It's the victims. 33 convictions are not a number, they are 33 worlds. And the fact that there are still unidentified victims is a brutal reminder that not everything is repaired by a sentence. For some families, time doesn't heal. Time just learns how to live with the question. And perhaps one of the most responsible functions of a documentary like this is precisely that: to prevent the story from becoming just legend, and to return, at least symbolically, humanity to those who were reduced to a file. And then, when the camera pulls back and the case becomes a panorama, what remains is a broader, almost philosophical, reflection on the human mind. Because Gacy's extreme double identity is not a supernatural trick. It's the sum of real elements: the ability to lie naturally, the coldness to compartmentalize, the need for dominance, the absence of practical empathy, and a social talent used not for connection, but for capture. The mask is not a mystery, it's a tool. And that raises two questions that hang in the air like an echo. Uncomfortable but necessary questions. How often do we confuse social presence with character? How often do we accept appearance as proof because it's more comfortable than investigating inconsistency? The truth is that cases like this aren't meant to fuel irrational fear. They're meant to sharpen perception, to remind us that reputation is not a diagnosis, that public usefulness is not a moral guarantee, that charisma can be just a method, and that when a young person disappears, urgency should be proportional to the value of a life, not to the judgment society places on that life. In the end, the Gacy case remains intricate not because facts are missing, but because the human mind resists accepting that horror can wear ordinary clothes. And perhaps the greatest form of prevention begins right there. Learning to see people as they are, not as they appear to be. Learning that signs matter, and that empathy is not naivety. It is ethical vigilance. The decision to take disappearance seriously, vulnerability seriously, the call for help seriously. Because when a community protects itself, it doesn't do so with paranoia. It does so with attention. And attention sometimes is the difference between a file that gets closed and a file that never should have been opened.